This is an odd time for the Shire. Isengrim, known now as Isengrim III, never did get married, and he's almost too old to take on a new job. It's lucky that these are quiet times. There's not much need for action. He can just maintain the status quo and see if he can live as long as his father. In the absence of a son, Isengrim's eldest brother, Isenbras, is now next in line for the Thane role. Isenbras, who is now 82. But Isenbras's line is secure. He has a son, Fortinbras, and even a grandson, Ferinbras, to continue the line. All the same, through the 1320s and into the 1330s, the Shire didn't change much. Nobody travelled, or if they did, they said nothing about it. The new Thane, Isengrim, held the role for just 10 years before his own death. Isenbras took over as Isenbras IV. But before anybody could settle down to the new name and change the stamps and coins or whatever they did in the Shire, Isenbras passed away too, in 1339 after just 9 years in the top job. His son Fortinbras stepped up as Fortinbras II. The many changes of Thanes scarcely caused a ripple in Shire daily life. You could almost say the Shire was stagnating, and when all the youngsters grew up, they took absolutely forever to get married. In a humble servant family in Hobbiton, a baby boy was born to Hobson Gamgee, whose surname Gamage had been mangled by inarticulate locals until the new pronunciation stuck. The proud parents called him Hamfast. At the exact other end of the social spectrum, in the same year, Adelgrim Took met and married a woman whose name is never mentioned. Adelgrim was the only child of Hildegrim Took and Rosa Baggins. His life, as far as we know, was a happy one. He was undoubtedly much loved by his parents, and pretty much everyone in the 5 families was his close cousin. 3 girls were born to them in rapid succession, and we can forget all about them because they aren't named in the tree. But Adelgrim finally managed an heir in 1333, a youngster called Paladin. Esmeralda followed in 1336. Over in Brandy Hall, Rory Brandybuck married Menegilda Gould in about 1339, and in 1340 their son and heir Saradoc was a newborn baby. Did Rory marry a rich woman? You have to wonder about a name like Menegilda Gould. Is that code for many gilded gold? If so, this would have contributed to the sobriquet Goldfather, but I still think my other theory holds. We know that the Took girls came with immense dowries and that Bag End was purchased with belladonnas. There were a lot of births and marriages and deaths that I've skipped to avoid this being just a long list. Hildegrim and Belladonna and Isenbras, for instance, all died in this decade. Rudiger Bolger and Jessamine Boffin were married. That's useful to know because their son Odovacar features in my next imagining. Which brings us gently through to Shire year 1340. The generations are all muddled again now. Everyone was taking longer to get married and having longer gaps between their children. That tidy chronology of the 1270s is a thing of the past. Tolkien's book The Hobbit took place this year. In The Hobbit, Bilbo Baggins left the Shire with Gandalf and some dwarves and was not heard from for many months. And just when they all thought he was dead, he showed up with a pony loaded with treasure. His antics inspired the younger hobbits of the district more than their parents ever realised. All the youngsters knew was that he'd left the Shire unexpectedly and returned with treasure. He'd found dragons, he'd fought orcs and trolls and come out alive, he'd met the king of the dwarves, and it was something that nobody would talk about. Bilbo used to pester Gandalf for stories of travel and exciting things, but this new generation didn't even know such stories existed. Some had grown up believing the somnolent Shire really was the whole world. Bilbo showed otherwise. It took a few years to sink in, but it stirred an interest in them that they'd not been aware of till now. For the new generation, those who were still children in 1340 and beyond, it was simply a fact. If you leave the Shire, you can find treasure and come back better than before. For the older ones, it was a bit more complicated. As it says in the end of The Hobbit, Bilbo lost his reputation through all the goings-on. Many who had included him socially stayed away. It didn't help that the other adventurers were reaching the ends of their days this decade. There were many funerals: Hildegrim in 1341, Isenbold in 1346, Rudiger Bolger in 1348, and Donnemira Boffin in 1348 as well. The fuss and confusion over Bilbo's supposed death and sudden resurrection continued until everyone settled back into their old ways, just not involving Mad Baggins in anything if they could respectfully leave him out. Sometime around now, in about 1346, Hamfast Gamgee began working at Bag End as an apprentice gardener, trained by his father's cousin Holman Greenhand. He obviously had no issue with Bilbo's past. And with that dealt with, we come to the 1350s. Here's my imagining of this decade and the next. In the 1350s, as happens in every generation, a group of young hobbits formed a strong friendship. They were brought together by Primula Brandybuck. She was the eldest of the friends by several years. I imagine her as a restless girl, torn between a strong yearning for all things family and a desire for novelty, for something grander and infinitely more important than her own life was so far shaping up to be. And torn between generations too. Being the youngest of 7, she was still a child when her older siblings were adults. Very few cousins were anywhere near her age, and being the youngest daughter, it was Primula's job to look after her parents as they aged, and that prevented her from making friends from outside Brandy Hall. Primula was an odd girl, very sociable, but one who also loved to spend time alone. A deep thinker, but a lover of all things frivolous, a contradiction in every way. Primula had many friends, but most were not the same kind of hobbit as she. In a generation of pragmatists, Primula was a dreamer. She had way too much imagination and not enough to occupy her mind, so she set herself a quest to find like-minded friends, the sort who saw life the way she did. By 1355 there were 5 of them. I'm calling them the Companionship of 5. The companions were all cousins of some degree, descendants of Gerontius Tuke. Among them were Paladin and Esmeralda Tuke, their second cousin Rosamunda Tuke, and their other second cousin Odovacar Bolger. Paladin and Esmeralda were the youngest children of Adelgrim Tuke. Their sisters were older and tended to leave the little ones out, so Paladin and Esmeralda formed a close bond of their own. As infants, they were a creative pair with a love of dressing up and creating poems and painting grand pictures full of bright colour. They loved stories and climbing trees and pretending there was magic in the world and imagining that they could understand the talk of animals. Now they were in their teens, but neither had shaken off the glamour of their early pretend worlds. They still made up poems, they still painted grand pictures. Paladin was still more likely to be found sitting on a fence top than on the ground like a sensible hobbit. Esmeralda had her own fashion sense. Her dresses were all flowing swirls of fabric like a maiden from the days of Isenbras III. The older hobbits didn't know how to take her, but nobody could say that Esmeralda wasn't charming and caring and always an excellent hostess, so it wasn't a real problem. The pair were a bit odd, but they were honest youngsters of strong intellect and honourable habits, so no one was too concerned. The tweens were like that, a time of experimentation. Paladin and Esmeralda found a very sympathetic friend in Primula Brandybuck, and she found their ideas enchanting. Rosamunda was the eldest child of Sigismund, the granddaughter of Hildebrand, and the great-granddaughter of Gerontius the Old Tuke. She was born in Shire year 1338, so in the 1350s she was only in her teens. Rosamunda had no fashion sense at all. She dressed in browns and greens and never seemed to notice if her bonnet matched her belt or not. She was quiet and dreamy and completely unobtrusive, but she had an odd trick of turning every feeling into a melody that she hummed unconsciously, and she was very good at it. Others quite felt the same emotions just from listening to her tunes, and she picked up on the feelings of others instantly, before even they knew how they felt. Rosamunda's companions found her perception and her music quite magical. Odovacar was very different, and yet not. Odovacar was a doer, a boy of action. Once he'd thought of a scheme, he was putting it in place. If there was a spider, he dealt with it immediately. If a handkerchief blew into a field, he was over the fence and chasing it down before anyone realised, regardless of what that field might hold. Odovacar was equally ready to believe in trolls and dragons, and his greatest wish was to come face to face with one and see what it really was made of. It was odd that Primula, who was nearly an adult by 1350, would spend so much time with the children. But not so odd that anyone felt concern. Primula was the perpetual child in the busy minds of her family. Being the youngest of so many, being so sweet and quiet, none noticed that she'd grown up at all. Plus, it was Primula's job to sit by her parents at all the dinners and gatherings and help when she was needed. They were old now, a little stiff in the joints, a little bit forgetful at times, so everyone knew that Primula was the reliable, caring type, and there wasn't much difference between caring for ageing parents and supervising a group of young cousins. But if anyone needed a world of escape, it was Primula. She loved the people in her world, would never have allowed anyone else to take her place at her parents' side. But at the same time, her own life was utterly constrained by her duties. She could not dance the night away. She could not drink too much wine and giggle into the shoulders of gallant young Hobbit men like her elder sisters did every so often. She could not even respond to a dinner invitation without checking her parents' schedules. Would she have wanted to do all that? No, she most certainly wouldn't. What she wanted was... At that point, Primula always came to a halt. She didn't know what she wanted. But when she was embroiled in the fantastical make-believe world of her young companions, Primula didn't want for anything. It was quite stimulating enough. Primula reached adulthood in 1353, and her young friends were moving into their tweens, and she probably ought to be thinking about marriage, but she wasn't. She couldn't, not with Gorbodoc and Mirabella needing so much. Gorbodoc walked with a stick now, and Mirabella's memory was failing very fast. And nobody else was suggesting it. Everyone was glad she was there to help Buckland's old master and his wife. Instead, she was living as if still in her tweens, with her friends. The 5 companions were bundles of courage and heroism in a sleepy, eventless world. They met regularly and talked about Bilbo's adventures and wondered just how far away the edge of the Shire really was. This was the new generation of youngsters, glimpsing a world beyond the carefully constructed society their parents had established for them. Like childhood Bilbo, they sought any clues about the great lands beyond in the conversation of those around them. They looked at the few old chests in great smiles that were clearly not of Shire manufacture. They pored over the few parchments still on display in the great smiles hall that had come from Banderbras all those centuries ago. Born at the time that they were, with the passing of so many of Gerontius's children, there was finally nobody to quell their spirit, no fearful parents keeping their children safe, no cautious grandparents cutting their questions off at the first word. They might have asked Gandalf, but once the old Took died, his visits were fewer, and more often to Bilbo at Bag End than to Great Smiles, where they had easier access to him. But there was one other person, one quiet man who they'd never really understood. One you'd never imagine could have done anything great, because he was old now and they'd not heard a word, and he did not show by a glance or emotion that he was made of the same remarkable stuff as their famed great-grandfather, or grandfather in the case of Primula. That man was Isengard Took. Paladin and Esmeralda learned by chance that he'd once left the Shire. They found one of his old letters, one he'd written home, in a trunk of old Hildegrim Took's belongings that had passed down to their father Adelgrim. They discussed the matter quietly that night when they should have been sleeping. Whether they could ask him about it, or if that was rude or some kind of bad behaviour on their part. In the end, they plucked up the courage and went to his rooms in Great Smiles when they knew he'd be around, and hesitantly raised the matter that they'd like to know what he saw when he left the Shire, if he was so inclined to tell them. It took a few seconds for Isengard to react. It had been decades since anyone viewed his life as anything but recklessness best forgotten. For those few seconds they thought he was deeply offended and started to apologise, until he chuckled and gestured them to a seat and began the first of many stories. Great Uncle Isengard became a favourite with the young hobbits after that, especially since he could come to Brandy Hall, where Primula could listen to the tales as well. Many evenings were spent with the five of them seated wherever they could in his rooms, with the fire stoked high, while he entertained them with every detail of his past. He told them not only of his own adventures, but those of Hildefon's as well, and then he told them of the pony rides in the hills, and the dwarves that used to pass through along the east road, and the elves to the west. He told them of the elf towers and how you could see the ocean from the top, and then he stretched deeper into the reaches of his memory and told them about Gerontius and Bandabras and the Battle of Greenfields and innumerable other tales. It was all new to the five young hobbits. They would have thought it all nonsense were it not Isengard himself telling them these things. Their own grandparents doing all that? It was time to revive the habits of a better age. They rediscovered the lost art of pony riding. They started boating and fishing on the river, something that was not done now in the way it used to be. They began to camp in the hills and had many tough nights with the wrong equipment before they got it right. Isengard helped. He showed them how to use a walking stick, what sort of backpack was best, how to start a campfire and string a fishing line and properly raise a tent. It was a shame he was too old to go out with them, but he was still a huge help. They turned into fit, strong young hobbit tweens and young adults. Then Isengard Took, last son of his generation, died in his sleep at Great Smiles in the winter of 1360. His death was very deeply mourned by the five companions. It might be noticed that there were no Bagginses among the children of this generation. They seem to be dying out. Bilbo hasn't married, and his cousins have hyphenated their names, so we do have a Sackville Baggins and a Chubb Baggins, but they've become surrogate elder sons for their wives' lines. Posco Baggins, the son of Polo, has 3 children, who are Ponto, Porto and Peony. Fosco, son of Largo, has 3 as well. That's Dora, Drogo and Dudo. Dora and Drogo are single and getting older. Dudo has 1 daughter, called Daisy. I'm pretty sure they're living either in the East Farthing or in Hobbiton. Not in Bag End, but in other houses round the town. Polo and his youngsters have no more involvement with our study, but they are still around. The Bagginses are slipping back into obscurity. This may have been a consequence of Bilbo's supposed fall from respectability after his adventure. They're still rich, they still have Bag End, but they're not marrying into the great families anymore, and what's worse, the adventurous spirit is being bred out of them through their stronger-minded spouses. This is what you see with Otho Sackville Baggins, and to a lesser degree with Dora Baggins, the way she is presented in the start of the fellowship. Over at Brandy Hall, Gorbodoc Brandybuck and his wife Mirabella stayed as hale and hearty as someone of their age can possibly be. They celebrated their 100th birthdays in 1360. Mirabella passed away later the same year. I see this as being the end of the companionship of 5. Not the end of the friendship between them all, but the end of their exclusive involvement with each other. Primula probably has little time free outside of caring for her father. And at about this time, Primula's nephew Saradoc joins their group. He's about the age of the younger ones after all, just 2 years younger than Rosamunda. Gorbodoc Brandybuck, Broadbelt, passed away in 1363 at the venerable age of 103. Primula's brother Rory-Mac, Saradoc's father, took over as master of Buckland. I'd say now was when Brandy Hall became a place of obvious wealth. Old Rory was raised with less emphasis on budgeting, and the whole of Buckland benefited from his expenditure. I don't see him as extravagant exactly, but no doubt he knew just what people would most like in the way of halls and bridges and stables and tractors and feasts, and he now supplied it all. Over in Hobbiton a year later, in 1364, Hamfast Gamgee married Bell Goodchild. We don't have a death date for old Holman, but I'd imagine, given the nature of gardening, especially in the Shire where it's all manual, that Ham Gamgee was doing the bulk of the work by now and was a full-time gardener. With the death of her father Gorbodoc, Primula was now free. How would it have felt? In 1363 she was 43 years old. The people she grew up with were married and they had children. Her friends, the 5 companions, were thinking about marriage now too. Primula certainly was a caring hobbit. She'd have made an excellent mother. But she wasn't about to marry the wrong man either. There's not so many single men left who would suit. The next few years passed. I imagine she threw herself into auntship and social life until she married Drogo Baggins in 1368. There's no information in the books about their marriage or their personalities, despite my imaginings here. Had she picked Drogo as the man for her years before and was just waiting till he realised it too? Was it the other way round? Or did they just not meet properly until after the death of Primula's parents and find that they were particularly well suited? Drogo's family probably thought he'd stay single forever, but in 1367, at the mature age of 59 years, he decided to go for it and tied the knot with Primula Brandybuck, who was then 47. Drogo and Primula had just one child, a son named Frodo, who, as we all know, was born on the 22nd September 1368, the same day that Bilbo turned 78. It's the first direct Baggins-Brandybuck marriage in the tree, and it's enough to bring the family back again from that obscurity that they were about to fall back into. This being a pivotal event in the Lota universe, let's look at eldest sons. In the Took line, there's no change. Fortinbras is still the Thane. We know very little about him, actually, just his dates. He lived at Great Smiles with his extended family. Ferinbras is now an adult. Born in 1316, he's 52 now and still single. The Brandybuck eldest son was Saradoc, son of Rorymac. Saradoc was now in his late tweens. In the Bolger household, the new eldest son was Odovacar, one of our group of friends, the eldest child of Heregar and Jessamine. This was his coming-of-age year, just turned 33. I'm guessing they were still somewhere near Whitfarrow, in the same house, but it was probably all refurbished and painted and fresh. Vigo Boffin is the newest eldest son for the Boffins. His father Jargo is in charge of the household. Vigo is still a child at this point. And in the Baggins family, it's Bilbo in Bag End. Unmarried Bilbo, who is now aged 78, which is why, when they thought he'd vanished in 1340, Otho and Lobelia claimed Bag End, Longo being the next son to Bungo. If Bilbo died without an heir, the estate passed quite legally to Longo's child, since Longo himself was now deceased. They were not wrong, just a bit hasty. In 1374, Paladin Took married Eglantine Banks. Paladin was the only son of Adelgrim. He was the older brother to Esmeralda, and I'm pretty sure he was a close friend to Primula Brandybuck. He and his wife settled in Great Smiles, and over the next few years 2 daughters, Pearl and Pimpernel, were born to the couple. Years passed without incident. We know from the Lota series all the events taking place outside the Shire, but that makes no difference inside. In 1379, Odovacar Bolger, son of Heregar, married Rosamunda Took, daughter of Sigismund. They moved into the Bolger household and in 1380 became parents to a baby boy named Fredegar. This is Fredegar Fatty Bolger, who is in the early chapters of the Fellowship of the Ring. Fatty Bolger's great-grandmother was Belba Baggins on the Bolger side, and one of his other great-grandmothers was Donamira Took, so he's related to Frodo through both Drogo Baggins and through Primula Brandybuck. Back in Bagshot Row, that row of cottages in Hobbiton right next to Bag End, Samwise Gamgee was born to Hamfast and Bell. He was their 5th child, born in the same year as Fredegar. And, as everyone who has read the books will know, Frodo's parents drowned in 1380 while boating on the Brandywine when Frodo was just a child. He was then raised in Brandy Hall by his Brandybuck relatives. I won't speculate on the cause of that terrible event. Tolkien gives a few gossipy suggestions himself in the conversation that occurs in the Ivy Bush, chiefly to point out, I think, that he has no intention of finding a suitable explanation for an event that makes very little sense when you think about the Brandybucks. Tolkien wanted Frodo to be an orphan for the book series, and Brandy Hall is next to the Brandywine, so it makes sense as a casual reference. The point for us is that Frodo was born in 1368, and after 1380 he's an orphan being raised with his Brandybuck cousins. So, who raised Frodo? I think it was Saradoc Brandybuck, eldest son of old Rory Brandybuck. In 1380 Saradoc was still single, but I'm pretty sure he was thinking about marriage, so maybe Frodo was with his uncle and aunt Rory and Menegilda at that time. But after 1381, when Saradoc married Esmeralda Took, I think Frodo lived with them. This is another second cousin match. Esmeralda's grandfather was Hildegrim Took. Saradoc's grandmother was Mirabella Took. In my imagined society of that time, I can see them taking young Frodo in. He was the firstborn child of the group of 5 childhood friends, and now an orphan. No doubt Odovacar and Rosamunda offered to have him too, but Frodo was a Brandybuck, and Primula's family probably wanted to keep him there. Frodo was hardly a stranger to Brandy Hall. It's not clear where he lived before his parents' death, but if it wasn't the Hall, it was somewhere very nearby. Maybe he didn't live with just one family. Maybe he spent a few months with each relative. But I think he at least spent a lot of time with Saradoc. And when Saradoc and Esmeralda's own baby was born, despite the age difference, Frodo and that baby were like brothers. It wasn't a huge difference, really. Frodo was 14 when the baby was born. That's closer than Gerontius Took and Maddock Brandybuck, or Gerontius Took and Mungo Baggins. And we know from the Fellowship of the Ring that Frodo and that baby were very close friends for their whole lives, as well as being all kinds of cousin. Saradoc and Esmeralda named their baby Meriadoc. He was known to all as Merry. He is Frodo's cousin once removed on the Brandybuck side through Rory Brandybuck, and Frodo's second cousin once removed on the Took side through Hildegrim and Mirabella. And there's a more distant connection through the Baggins side too. Frodo and Merry, we know, were particularly close. Frodo was older, but it's obvious from the books that they knew each other more intimately than they knew most of their other cousins. It might have been very hard on Merry when Frodo left the Hall and became Bilbo's heir. That said, all the cousins still met and played and grew up together. The final generation is emerging now. We've had Bilbo for decades. We have Frodo, Fredegar and Merry. Paladin, as mentioned before, was the only son. There was going to be no more Tooks to carry on Hildegrim's line if Paladin didn't marry and have a son. Not that I think he'd have married just for an heir. Look at Isengrim and Bilbo. It wasn't something a hobbit was ever compelled into doing. Paladin and his wife Eglantine no doubt settled at Great Smiles, since that is what Tooks do. They had 4 children. The only one of relevance to us is the youngest, Peregrine Took, born in 1390. Paladin being Esmeralda's brother, Peregrine was Merry Brandybuck's first cousin. When Frodo moved to Bag End, Peregrine, known as Pippin, obviously became Merry's close companion. They were only 8 years apart. They were cousins. It worked well. And this brings us to the end of this study. All of the Lota characters have now been born: Bilbo, Frodo, Merry, Pippin, Sam and Fredegar. There's one other that I've skipped because it was confusing enough, and that is Folco Boffin. He's the son of Vigo, grandson of Jargo, and Folco was another good friend of Frodo's. It's time for a final look at eldest sons. In 1390 in the Took family, it's Ferinbras, now aged 76 and still single. Over at Brandy Hall, it's Meriadoc Brandybuck, our Merry. In the Bolger family, it's Fredegar Bolger, our Fatty. In the Boffin line, it's Folco Boffin, and in the Baggins, it's Frodo by adoption. So there you have it. All our familiar Hobbit characters are actually rather important people from important families with good prospects, except for Sam, who is the 5th son of a labouring family. To conclude this video, I'd like to discuss something that's a spoiler for the book and movie, in that it confirms that one particular character lives right to the end. If you don't want that, either stop watching now until you've seen the movie or read the book, or skip forward to the end spoiler card. You have 3 seconds to stop the video. Okay, I want to talk about the Thainship and how many family members had to die or fail to be born for Pippin to one day become Thane. As for Pippin, you wouldn't think he could possibly become Thane. His great-grandfather was Hildegrim Took, 4th son of the Thane, and yet Isengrim did not marry, so the Thainship passed to his brother Isenbras, who passed it to his son Fortinbras. It then passed to his son Ferinbras in 1380, and then Ferinbras dies unmarried in 1415, which is beyond the scope of this history. But who gets the Thainship after Ferinbras? He was the only son of an only son. The path of inheritance goes all the way back in search of the next brother, who turns out to be Hildegrim. But Hildegrim is deceased now, so it comes down to Adelgrim, also deceased, moves down again to Adelgrim's only son Paladin, who does, in fact, become Thane. The boy in my imagined companionship of 5 who listened to the stories of Isengard. He's perfectly able for it, of course, and I like to think he was one of the group who revived small-scale adventuring in the Shire, which meant that Frodo and Merry and Pippin and their companions could all ride ponies and knew how to camp and were familiar with long walks. So I like the idea of Paladin becoming Thane, but I really didn't see it coming. And this leaves Pippin next in line for Thane of the Shire. So, there you have it. I don't remember that being in the trees when I first looked at them. The only future event I remember was Sam's marriage and his having, I thought it was about 6 children, but there's more in the trees now. I think Tolkien liked his characters so much he couldn't leave them in social obscurity. He wanted greatness for them all, so they got it. And there's nothing wrong with that. To conclude, here's a small scene from the Fellowship of the Ring early in Chapter 3, 3 Years' Company, just before they set out from Bag End. Autumn was well underway before Frodo began to worry about Gandalf again. September was passing and there was still no news of him. The birthday and the removal drew nearer, and still he did not come or send word. Bag End began to be busy. Some of Frodo's friends came to stay and help him with the packing. There was Fredegar Bolger and Folko Boffin, and of course his special friends Pippin Took and Merry Brandybuck. Between them, they turned the whole place upside down. There is quite a bit of all these hobbits, plus Sam, in the early part of the Fellowship, but this paragraph has all their names together. And it's interesting to see how deeply connected they actually are to each other, to see how Tolkien uses world building to substitute for character depth, because while his characters have some uniqueness to their personalities, and they all have distinct voices in the narrative, we don't get much of a look inside their heads, at their motivations or their priorities, or of what impact their vanishing out of the Shire might have on their families and their communities. But after looking at the trees, even if you don't agree with my takes on the individuals, you can see what place each hobbit actually plays in their starting world. And that's cool. Here ends my study of 5 families. Thank you for watching my video.